Hello and welcome to Backstory, the show about books, the craft of writing and the people behind the lines. I'm Mel Cranenburgh and so good to be here with you all today, live and live streaming from Melbourne's RRR. A huge thanks to Samira this morning on the score. As always, fantastic music and truly thought-provoking interviews. There were just so many great ones on the show. Can I just recommend listening back because there's some really important ones in there. Absolutely excellent. It is the kind of radio you want, and you can definitely catch the score each Wednesday from 9 till 12 or streaming on rrr.org.au ever after. Also, many of our shows, including this one, are available as podcasts. So hop on the RRR website for links or subscribe through your favourite podcatcher. You definitely should get among it. I will be with you until 1 p.m. today when I hand over to Beth AQ in the Glasshouse for more stories about storytellers. Before I start, though, I would like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting today from the lands of the original storytellers of this place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, here where their sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to their elders, past and present, and those of all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tuning in today. So today's special edition of Backstory will be live and live streamed across FM, digital, the RRR website and all over the socials. So if you are on a different platform, hop onto one where you can see our faces. A rare opportunity. I definitely think at least to see my guest, if nothing else. I will be speaking today with acclaimed poet, essayist and editor Omar Sakr about his latest work, a debut novel, for the first time filling out the worlds he so powerfully creates in his poetry. Omar is the award-winning author of two poetry collections, These Wild Houses and The Lost Arabs. His latest work, Son of Sin, explores a complex web of family ties and ruptures, cultural connection and dislocation, diaspora and home, of deep silences and sudden violence, queerness, literature, faith, and the hidden worlds, both metaphorical and supernatural, that push against the structure of reality. The book follows Jamal Smith, a young queer Muslim trying to escape a past in which memory and rumour trace ugly shapes in the dark. Omar Sakr joins me now to discuss Son of Sin, his writing, and the craft behind it. Omar, welcome to Backstory.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, I did not mention which awards you won with your poetry, but one of them was very famously the Prime Minister's Award in 2020. You've also been shortlisted for numerous awards.
That's all right. We don't have to go through all that. It's all good.
Well, the reason that I would like to do that, or at least to touch on it, is that people will know your name, and they'll know your name from the poetry that you write. And I feel as though this is one of those instances where, you know, people are going to talk about shifting media that you write and or the shifting way you write. But I feel as though this is such an extension of all of the poetry that you've written that it feels totally congruous with your overall work. How did you feel, though, being able to stretch out beyond the bounds of that demanding form that is poetry?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I'm really happy to hear it, that the connection is obvious. My voice is the same in many ways. And yeah, and I think you even touched on it in your introduction, that if poetry is, you know, small moments of insight, it's language synthesized, it's emotion synthesized into language. And this novel really is me showing you the world that I came from, where those insights are generated.
Yeah, I was reflecting when I was reading it on a piece that, in fact, people can look it up online. You read so beautifully a piece called Ghosting the Ghetto, and I was struck by a couple of lines in that poem. Climbed Mount Lebanon in the lounge, cooling our bodies beneath old olive trees. And later on in that poem, in that metaphor and country are one. And I really felt so strongly while, you know, this covered different landscape to the book. I felt that landscape in that book, that, you know, that sense of, you know, what it's like to be someone in diaspora, what it's, you know, how that tangibly feels in this, not only in beautiful metaphor, but in a sense that's concrete, weirdly. I'm, you know,
Mm.
I did feel that reading through this, and I am wondering, you know, what is it that, you know, when you went through, because I feel on in each line of this book that there is work going on a line by line basis. How did you let yourself into the narrative just to flow along in long form without stopping yourself to interrogate every line as a poet would?
The short answer is that I didn't, which is to say, I was fairly obsessive with the sentences, you know, to the point where my wife would say to me, like, stop. You know, it's not poetry. It's you don't have to you don't have to do this or treat it in the same way. Um, but you know, I can't help that kind of uh, it's anxiety, really. I would call it, people call it perfectionism. That's a nicer word for it, maybe, but it's this anxiety that never really leaves me, and forces me to kind of constantly retrace my steps, retrace my words. Um, but at the same time, you know, I feel like I have been waiting a very long time to tell my story. Um, I do feel like I grew up in a kind of enforced silence, uh, cultural silence. On the one hand, in our family, you know, you're not supposed to speak back to your elders. Um, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, right? It's very hard to understand that literal truth has no bearing. It's that person's older than you, shut your mouth. Um, and so, yeah, it kind of just has been bursting out of me these past few years in poetry and in essays and now in this novel. And all I really have to do is let it happen, and then go over it fairly obsessively to elevate it.
I want to come back to that idea of silence. But before we do, let's take a step back. I would love you to, for the reader in your own words, talk about what you feel this story is about.
Yeah, this story follows a character named Jamel Smith, was born and raised in Western Sydney like me. I call him in the acknowledgements of the book a distant avatar. And I feel like that's uh, true. Um, and it is about his struggles to uh, be himself, really, in his family and in this country. Um, and I really wanted to showcase his life over a significant number of years, so that you could see the impact of the events that are occurring at home, and then also in society, both uh, nationally speaking and internationally.
Uh, I want to come back to, I mean, there's a lot to unpick, and I want to get into it because there's many themes that you cover. But to come back to this idea of silence, I found that quite an affecting element in this book. There's one moment when the character sort of, you know, reflects that the neighbours are always calling the cops when they're just living their normal life, having parties, having barbecues, you know, having gatherings of people, you know, because the neighbours obviously, you know, it's a racially motivated thing that's happening. And there's this reflection that, you know, in Arab families, only silence, you know, is the kind of scary thing, or words to that effect, or is the thing to be scared of. And I wanted to kind of touch on that because you do powerfully show that this idea of, you know, what lurks behind the silence, what silence means, literal silence, but also the metaphorical silence of someone unable to say who they are without consequences that are beyond devastating. how much of this informed, you've just said this is literally your reason for writing. How much of the work is really about this silence and disrupting it?
Yeah, a lot of it, a lot of it. It's yeah, it's hard. But I did want to kind of illustrate how much this silence is Jamel's, and by extension mine. That in our family and in our communities, it's so boisterous, it's so raucous. We're usually so loud, and so even even what he is being kind of forced to do, which is be quiet, is a strangeness. And then as well, there's the silence of the silences that we enforce on ourselves, the things that we're not willing to articulate, to face on our own. And these, I think, can be the most difficult. And I hope I show you that in the novel. Because what happens when you do speak, what happens when you do articulate these things, your fears will say that it's only going to be damaging, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah. The corollary to the silence is, of course, what you were touching on, which is this sense of constant noise, of constant things happening. And one thing that occurs to me, I also come from quite a collectivist family, is this idea of, it's very easy to hide in that in fact, lies become, or what's not spoken becomes the only way you can have a boundary from the people around you in where you bleed into one another in the normal course of things. These sometimes families that seem like they're always talking are the ones that keep the deepest secrets. And I felt this quite keenly reading this, that it's that sense that you almost are the other person, or you have a right, or you own the other person, is very there. And so the only way to get a sense of yourself is in fact to have secrets or, lies.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between secrets and silence, right? That they're related.
They are related.
And I think you're absolutely right in saying that some secrets are necessary for our survival. And I certainly felt that growing up, even as at the same time, those secrets also felt like they were killing me. And there's this like unresolvable tension between the two. And I'm still kind of dealing with that, because for all that we speak about coming out as an idea, it's not really what occurs. Certainly not in my family, where, damaging and horrible truths can be uttered like a mile, just like so many in a conversation that you can't keep track of them. And what happens is a forgetting. I think I've had a kind of coming out style conversation with my mom like 6 times since, and I only came out to her like several months ago, so it's not like but there's this kind of, I can't deal with this. I can't think about it. I can't handle it, because if I do, then we're going to have to change. And so it gets buried.
Yeah. It's really beautifully realized in this book, these complexities. There's nothing in this that, no character in this that doesn't feel as though you're getting, multiple facets of them. They're not simple characters. There's no, easy, simple cliche that you're leaning on in any instance. Jamal's relationship with his mother is, you could say it's tumultuous, to put it mildly, violent. It's, it has such a strong, clannishness to it, but at the same time, it's incredibly damaging. It's so complex, but at the same time, there's this real sense of, Hala, the mother, being someone who has done, she's got her own kind of wild character who is the product of her own struggles. You never feel like you're wholly condemning her at any stage for the quite violent way that she reacts to her sons. I'm really interested in that relationship because it is a crucial one for the narrator. He literally, his mother literally takes his name as a brand of ownership over him from an absentee or completely absent father, and gives her son her last name. So there's this real moment where, there's several little deaths, not to be punny, that Jamal has, but there's, this is kind of the original one where his identity is reforged by his mother. Can you talk a bit about that element?
Yeah, it's unusual in our culture for children to take their mother's name. It's expected that they have their father's name, and I did until I was a teenager, and so this is actually from my life. And but I think there's something also beautiful in it, because it wasn't until she felt that he was being taken away from her in some way, that she realized, even though they lived together, she hadn't actually claimed him. And yeah, I think it's those nuances that are really important. Like you say, I never want to be completely condemning a person, whether imagined or not.
There are, there are other instances of this, memorably, without giving too much away, Jamal's relationship with his father, that pops up later in the book. Relationship with cousins that are very complicated and sometimes slightly disturbing as well, that, you're not quite sure where to place. All of them are done with such a humanity, despite really not pulling any punches. There's a lot of, descriptions of violence that are, quite extreme, and they're not sugar-coated. You give them pause at the same time as winding in these mitigations that the reader can absorb. I'm fascinated in how you've done it, and would love to have spent more time just going back over how you laid in these ideas of a person that we can absorb without recoiling. How do you feel you managed to achieve that balance between this kind of really hard-hitting realism that's quite brutal and a sense of a person beyond that?
Well, I think what's important there is time. And that's why I needed the book to cover, I think it's almost 15 years, because I needed to show you the world and the environment that these characters lived in. And when you see that, you have a chance to understand why and how they behave the way that they do. We're all products of our environment. And one of the really hard things to learn when you're growing up is that, your parents, the older people around you, were shaped by very different environments. And so, of course, there's a distance between you. And yeah, I think that's the main part of it, but also for me, and I think for us more broadly, my family, my community, there's so much awful shit that happens that we can only respond to it with laughter, like half the time. Um, and it's always been strange to me to read books that like hinge on like one traumatic moment or like one and it's like a plot point. It's like this sad thing happened to this otherwise like perfect life, or otherwise like middle class life. And you know, I've forgotten more traumas than I've seen in these books, and it's just like, and I feel like that's true for a lot of us. You know, we are in some ways desensitized to the extremes, and we're used to laughing about it. And it's usually not until I'm in a conversation with um, someone outside my experiences, I guess, someone outside the community, I'll say something as a joke and, you know, kind of laugh about it. And they'll be like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
That happened? Oh my God, are you okay? or, or you all need therapy, which is true. Or, you know, some other kind of exclamation. But yeah, these are the ways um, in which we live, and
There is,
we experience them all a bit differently.
yeah, there is one moment though, isn't there, where, you know, Jamal's with a friend who's, you know, acknowledging the kind of quite horrific abuse he got, you know, that trying to push him into playing Aussie rules and from his father, that relationship. And in the telling of it, you know, Jamal's kind of like impulse,
Rugby league.
rugby league, sorry, AFL,
Yeah,
such a
it's not.
Melburnian.
Yeah.
Not just rugby league, like horror show, you know, football, shall we say, or rugby. So he's been pushed into a sport he doesn't want to play. Um, you know, his father reacts brutally. He relates this, and Jamal's processing it and immediately wants to make light of it in some way, or do a, you know, kind of quid pro quo of like horror stories and then move on. Instead, he just suddenly realizes he can't, that in fact this is awful and he has to sit with it. I'm really interested in those little moments because it is destabilizing, this normalization of the trauma that many of the
Yeah.
characters have gone through. Can you chat about that? Because it is, to me, it did feel like a moment of, this is the shaping of someone who doesn't want to look away. A writer, in fact.
Yeah. Um, I yeah, this is one of the really big things. I think in male relationships, particularly, um, but maybe just even more broadly than that, um, where we've developed this um, kind of this mask of indifference, and you know we just call it banter when we're often actually just being cruel to each other. Um, and then one of the things I wanted to dig into in this book is that kind of habit, you know, the muscle memory of relationships, and how do we break out of them? And it does require an awareness of the script, this kind of script that we all carry with us about how we're going to respond to things. And um, so once you have that, having that awareness, but then also consciously acting against it. And it's really difficult because it feels awful. You feel so vulnerable in doing it, but you also kind of, in some way, it's you feel like you're making the other person feel bad by not dismissing it. And that's, I don't know why we act that way, but it's yeah, it's not true.
You're not playing your part in the little pantomime
Yeah,
that keeps things calm on the surface somewhat. Yeah, I think it occurs to me, and certainly want to talk more about this later on, that Jamal's particularly well placed as a character, and perhaps you as a writer, obviously you as a writer, to explore some of this because of his place in the kind of liminal space between worlds. So there is an observation necessary in that. To not quite fit the narrative ever oneself means you're always questioning narratives. It's something I've experienced in my own life for not dissimilar reasons, but I think here it's really beautifully realized that, there were many moments when Jamal's sitting back and going, how do I fit here? And so therefore, is any of this as it should be? There's a natural questioning when you sit in those in between spaces.
Yeah, I think as an artist, you have to make uncertainty your home. And I guess I am very well positioned in that sense because it's always been my home. Um, until, actually, until very recently, I would say I have felt some sense of precarity until I met my wife and fell in love with her. And I think it was that knowing that I'm loved completely, that she knows me and sees me, all of me, is actually what has enabled me to go into all of these kind of terrifying moments again.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really, I think, this is your life experience. And I think and in fact, I do want to talk about that because to write this book, you've obviously had to go into spaces that are, riffing off your own experiences in life, but are deep, dark places that are triggering. And I want to talk about how that's, transformed into fiction in a way that feels authentic. But that does give you a sort of basis, having that support. We don't often talk about the need for writers to, put themselves in the dangerous place. How do you do that if you don't have a solid support?
You shouldn't.
Yeah, bottom line, you shouldn't. I want to explore that more, but if you just joined us, listeners, you're either listening to or streaming Triple R's Backstory, a show about books, writing, and the people behind the lines. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and I'm speaking today with acclaimed poet, essayist, and editor Omar Sakr about his debut novel, Son of Sin, this very striking looking cover, which you wouldn't have this unpublished proof. Should be showing a more finished version. Really fantastic book. Omar, I'm going to take a quick break now to play some sponsorship announcements. There's so much we've touched on in the book that I really want to explore so much more. And I'm hoping after we come back, we can also touch on one element that I particularly found, I loved in this book and that you did so well, and perhaps have a reading as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. You're listening to Backstory on Triple R. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and on today's show, we're doing a special in conversation with acclaimed poet, essayist, editor Omar Sakr about his debut novel, Son of Sin. Omar, I want to talk about one element of this book that I'm sure is going to be discussed, and that is this inclusion of the hidden world that is so subtly wound in. Jinns and angels live alongside the characters. They're sometimes trying to push through, especially at night, but sometimes not at night, to get to the characters, to mess with them, to reflect their worlds in a frightening way as well. It works as a metaphor, but it is really real for the characters and the world that they inhabit. Can you talk about this? Because I feel like it is going to be talked about as magic realism, and I think it is only in the sense that it is realism. It's a part of this, it's knitted into the fabric of this world. Talk to me about how you've blended these realities in with the main story reality.
Yeah, there's no blending of reality. I mean, it is just our reality.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't want people to talk about it as though it's magic realism. It's not. Um, this is a social realist novel as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, angels and jinn and devils are part of our understanding of the world, and they're quite literal figures as far as the Muslim community is concerned. And it does something to you. That does something to you when you're a kid and you are introduced to this idea that there are invisible beings kind of watching you all the time. And so I definitely wanted to have that as part of the book because it wouldn't be true to life otherwise.
Mm, absolutely. I mean, and this is the thing, it is naturalistically drawn. It doesn't feel incongruous at all with the worlds that we're reading about. I want you to give us a little bit of a glimpse of that, if that's okay. Perhaps there's a reading that we discussed that that illustrates this, that how congruous these worlds are.
Yeah. So this is a short reading from my book, Son of Sin. Stop talking about them, Rania said. You invite their attention. They each had experiences, and despite Rania's warning, they told them over and over again. Jamel's first began as a dream. He was in his tata in Judbu's flat in Warwick Farm. Their lounge, with its flower print couches, framed Quranic tapestries on the wall, and red Persian carpet, seemed carved out of another time. He was both present and not, could see everything and only the back of his head, as though he walked behind himself. He followed the figure into the hallway, to the first bedroom on the left, and as his double opened that door, he turned and smiled at Jamel. His eyes were molten black, and the look of malevolent joy on his face froze Jamel's blood. He woke up. He was on the floor, enveloped by Jihad's and Sarah's snores. He didn't see his doppelganger enter the room. He was simply there, his eyes windows of night, his hands around his throat. Jamel tried to scream and nothing came out. There was only a relentless wave of pain and fear. He told the others it stopped when he recited the Fatiha, and sometimes that was true. Other times it went on, it seemed, until the jinn got bored. They had little proof of the divine without these episodes of devilry. In theory, one implied the existence of the other, but Jamel felt nothing except terror. No matter how hard he found fasting, Ramadan would always be his favorite time of the year for one simple reason. It was the only time the gates of hell were fastened shut and evil spirits denied entrance to the world. It was the only time he felt close to safe.
Yeah, it's I found that quite powerful, and actually this idea of the jinn as these incredibly dark, dangerous characters that are always there is somewhat leavened at the end when you know, there's a jinn that sort of appears in a way that becomes a moment of humor almost, that their dark presence is, they're trying to be ominous, but actually the characters are sort of like, you know, treating them like a family, an annoying family member, which I thought was, you know, just a really wonderful kind of this idea of acceptance, I guess, of the world one finds oneself in, no matter how scary it is, no matter how dark it is. It kind of really felt like the perfect way to describe that in many ways.
Yeah, and it's often portrayed in mainstream culture as a kind of horror story, right? But there's a passage before that what I just read, which um, describes them as free-willed spirits of the invisible world, which is true as far as our religion and culture is concerned. They're not malevolent, all of them, right?
Their own
And
agenda.
sorry,
They have their own agenda, much like
yeah,
yeah.
no, exactly. And I remember when was talking to my auntie one time, and she said, you know, a jinn could be Catholic if it wanted. You know, a jinn could be a cat. Like it's entirely up to them. They are a separate race who have their own agency, like humans, and unlike angels who don't.
It's funny because I always thought of the character of Hala as very kind of Jinn-like in some ways, this kind of mercurial character that had, you know, was wild at heart and had been contained in ways that didn't work for her. She has that quality to her. So I thought that interaction later on in the book between her and a Jinn felt very natural to me. Of course, she would speak their language, feel, you know, as a weird kind of slightly dismissive kinship. You know, and an interesting character who doesn't play by the rules of, you know, what she was brought up to do or be. She, you know, is imperfect, is perhaps misunderstood, is seen as dangerous or violent at times, but in fact is much more complex than that. It felt to me like an echo. I hope that's not too much of a stretch, but it definitely, it felt like there was a relationship between those entities.
That is an interesting observation. That's all I'll say.
Right. Well, you know, again, I feel like we are kind of very much cherry picking what's going on in this book. It's not, it's a very decent size at knocking up close to 300 words for a novel, but it contains pages, sorry, words, pages.
It'd be a very short novel.
Thank you for the correction. Second today, I appreciate that. The 300 words, but it's really, you know, I think probably your writing style of like of really compressing things gives it that weight, that heft, that it does feel like there's just so much to unpick here because you've kind of, you know, again, that ability, that poet's ability to imbue each line, each thought with so much more than, you know, the literal amount of words on the page. So to touch on just some of what, you know, is dealt with in this book. A really big one, obviously, is the idea of queerness. We have touched on that earlier in the interview, the idea of queerness within the context of the intersecting cultures Jamel is a part of, particularly the idea of the lack of acceptance or the lack of rightness of it within that world, and finding a way to make that right somehow is a big theme. I want you to talk a little bit about that, but also I have to say, you know, you write sex in this in a way that is both absolutely, you know, no holds barred. You're going there, you're writing detail, but it also has a warmth and, you know, realness to it that I feel is worth noting, because there's a lot of bad sex. There's a lot of bad sex writing, and I feel like this book is an example of, you know, what you can do to do it well. So maybe we can touch on that as well.
Okay. So am I talking about sex? Am I
Maybe if
talking
we
about...
start with the idea, what am I talking about? We start with the idea of queerness itself and within the context of this book and how you explored it.
Yeah, look, I think it's not for me a matter of, oh, queerness is treated as wrong within, you know, the Arab Muslim community. It's treated as wrong within the Australian community. And so there's that doubling effect at work. And I don't know that this is something that is ever going to be reconciled necessarily, personally speaking. I think it's more about my queerness, my faith, my cultures, and my relationship to them is fluid and kind of always changing. So it's more about allowing that, attending to it, and yeah, and I think and I wanted to show that in the book, you see the effects not just on Jamal, but also on his friends, on Ilo and Emmy, his Samoan and Bosnian queer friends in Western Sydney, and who are also grappling with just growing up in Australia and being queer and in a very violent and hyper masculine space.
It kind of speaks, I mean, again, to that idea of diaspora as well, isn't it? Because there is this kind of holding on to elements of culture that would not in a home country necessarily be held onto in quite the same way. And I think that there's that, these intersecting elements that go on, but also that idea of, like there isn't a binary here. There isn't one. Everyone, as you've described, struggles, and particularly Jamal struggling with, coming out as bi or understanding their own nature, which is itself, again, between these absolute categories that everyone wants to force people into. There's nothing about Jamal that is a binary, and I think in many ways, one of the things about this that's so interesting is that the struggle to understand queerness is really beyond that, a struggle to understand being between, the idea of binary cultures that some, I feel in, we're starting to understand the idea of, say, gender fluidity or non-binary gender. I feel sometimes more than the idea of non-binary race or culture in our quite homogenized society. I think that there is also that idea of, what is it to be between these other worlds, and how does one define oneself in a more complex and nuanced way?
Oof, I don't know about non-binary race. I'm not quite sure what that means. I mean, there's mixed race, and I'm Turkish and Arab, but I grew up in the Australian context, and yeah, I think we've got to be
reductive rather than saying it is a literal,
Yeah, and I guess I'm
yeah.
An awareness of how you relate to the aspects of identity, right? That uh, define us. And so, and my great grandparents were Afghan, but I don't call myself Afghan. I have no relationship to them, to that place. And maybe that will change one day, God willing. I don't know. But yeah, I don't like binaries, certainly, and I'm against borders, and it's always more interesting to be fluid.
Absolutely. And I think that, a book like this does start to challenge blind assumptions about anything, effectively anything that gives an insight into a character in their full complexity, in the full complexity of where they come from, of how that works, starts to dismantle, I guess, a lot of the assumptions more broadly in society. It's a real, I don't want to use that active empathy trope, but I guess it is the only time of pause that we have, is spending time like this in long form in someone else's perspective, forced to kind of, engage with complex ideas and themes. I'm really intrigued, so, with that in mind, as to how you felt writing it. I mean, this is unpacking a lot of things that you yourself must have thought about, have talked about, have written about. It's your story, and yet not, as you say, it's a distant avatar of yourself. So you have some critical distance in writing it. But approaching the page with all that in mind, thinking about what you're going to pin down, how you're going to do it, how you're going to capture that. How did that feel to try to do?
Yeah, it was haunting and painful. And I developed this obsessive tick where I was quite literally tearing out my beard as I wrote, and to the point where I started developing patches. And I was using the pain to literally distract myself from the pain that I was feeling while writing. And I needed therapy to understand that and get away from it. And I want to, highlight this. We touched on it earlier, the need for support. This book didn't happen by chance, didn't happen by accident, wasn't easy to do. And I have lived a fair amount of it. And so writing isn't enough. You need help, you need medical support. And I've had that, and I'm very grateful to have had it. And you also need love, and I have that too. Thank God. So yes, it was hard. I got through it. And I shared what I was going to do with my closest friends as well. So we had those conversations, which were not easy, but ultimately it's what needed to happen.
And then you have to go out and talk about it.
Yeah, you do. And it sucks. It sucks, to be honest, you spend 2 years writing this thing, and then you kind of have to talk about it all the time. And really, I just want to say to everyone, just read it and then go talk to each other about it. And then maybe every now and then include me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great point, Emma. There's this presumption. I mean, let's be honest. You write a book. The idea is to get out there and sell the book. And writers, as you've just described so eloquently, are spending so much time really pulling out the depths of themselves to create these works, particularly, a work of this kind of sensitivity and complexity. And then you have to go out and kind of shill a bit for it. And it's a tough call for a writer. You're obviously someone who has done public speaking and have that kind of element that can maybe give you a level of distance. But yeah, it's a big ask.
It's a lot of extra work, is what I'll say. But the reason I do it isn't because I think, this is going to move so many extra copies of my book. I know it's not really. The reason that I do it is because there is so much confusion, there is so much misinterpretation deliberately of Arabs and Muslims and queer people as well in our society. And so I do feel that I have to kind of be part of the shaping of the book and how it's talked about. I have to be present so that I can ensure that it's not used for harm.
Yeah. Well, I feel as though there's so much more I want to ask you about. You've been more than generous, and given what we've just been discussing, thank you. I do hope people prove you wrong and then go out and buy enormous numbers of the book because it is fantastic and deserves to be read. And thank you for the contextualization today. That was really fantastic.
Thank you so much.